Okay. Recent discussions of personal identity raised two important questions about the nature of connection, if any, between two questions concerning personal identity, what I'll call the metaphysical question and the practical question. In fact, this is going to be a key word for this sort of practical versus whatever. I know it already. What I call the metaphysical question and the practical question. The metaphysical semantic question concerns what are the logically necessary and sufficient conditions for persons such as you or I to persist through time and change. Today, for instance, I'm sitting in front of a computer in Sydney digesting a curry, thinking about the problem of personal identity and wearing blue jeans. Last week, I was lying on a beach in Queensland, digesting a salad sandwich and thinking about Venice. What's a salad sandwich? I'm thinking about Venice and wearing a bathing suit. Next week, hopefully I'll be wearing a warm coat and strolling the streets of Venice in person. What makes these different person stages of a single persisting person me, rather than different stages or stages in my life history, rather than different persons or stages in my life history, not someone else's. Also, thanks to participants of the Conference on Practical Identity and Narrative Agency, Macquarie, for helpful comments. Special thanks to these people. An important note about terminology. I use person stage simply as a convenient shorthand way of talking about how a person is at a time neutral between 3 and 4 dimensionalist accounts of persistence and other substantive further issues concerning the relationship between person stages and persons. Rather than asking what makes a person lying on a beach to digest a sandwich, etc. on January 2nd, 2006, the same person who is the same person as the person sitting at the computer digesting a curry, etc. on January 8th, 2006, we can simply ask what makes these different person stages stage of the same person. 3-dimensionalists will understand talk of a person stage. Let's talk about a person wholly present at a time, while 4-dimensionalists will take it to be talk of a temporal part of a person. Everyone can thus make use of the shorthand. Talk of person stages here presupposes no particular controversial ontological commitments. Answers to the metaphysical question seek to specify a criterion of identity for persons, the conditions governing when a person persists from an earlier to a later time. Often the metaphysical question is stated as a question about literal or numerical identity as opposed to qualitative identity. Eric Olson, for instance, formulates it like this, where the conditions under which something that is a person at one time is identical with anything that at all that exists at another time. See Olson 1997-25. While nothing crucial hinges on the current context, in the current context, I think the metaphysical question is better formulated so as to leave open the possibility that the relation of being the same person over time is not an identity relation. Cool. Stage theorists, for instance, treat the relation of being the same person as a counterpart relation among distinct momentary objects. See Sider and Hawley. Stage theorists who presuppose a substantive theory as the nature of the counterpart relation of being the same person are plausibly still offering an answer to the metaphysical question, an answer that would tell us when stages are the same person and when they're not, even when they deny that this is not an identity relation. Fine. That was 2. They seek to tell us exactly how earlier and later stages must be related to each other in order to be stages of one and the same person. The answer will depend on what kind of changes or events persons such as you or I could possibly survive, and which would quite literally cause us to cease to be. The answer might lie in the psychological relations between different person stages, such as those of memory, intention, values, and character, as psychological continuity theories claim, or else in bodily relations, as bodily continuity theories claim, or else in some or another conjunction of bodily and psychological theories, or else the relation of being one the same person over time might simply be taken as primitive and unanalyzable as advocates of the simple view maintain. The practical question concerns what relations among different person stages should structure our practical concerns regarding persons, such as prudential concern for the future, regret or remorse for past actions, ascriptions of moral legal accountability, and ongoing property entitlements. Suppose we're wondering whether it would be reasonable to hold a certain person morally and legally responsible for a past crime. How must this person be related to an earlier person who committed the crime in order for it to be appropriate to consider holding her accountable for it? Or suppose you learn that someone tomorrow will be in great pain. How must that person be related to you in order for it to be reasonable for you now to feel fear or dread at this prospect rather than, say, sympathy? Or suppose that a person in the past did hurtful things to someone dear to her in a moment of anger. How must the later person be related to that earlier person in order for her to have a reason to feel regret or remorse for this action and to acknowledge herself under a special obligation to try to make amends? It's natural to think that the metaphysical question and the practical question are intimately connected. And in fact, since that was such a good description, let's just put it basically at the top. It is natural to think that the metaphysical question and the practical question are intimately connected. The relation that should structure prudential concern, ascriptions of moral and legal accountability, ongoing property entitlements, and so on is that of being one and the same person. For instance, we ordinarily think that a person has a reason to fear future pain when and only when it will be her pain and not someone else's pain. Fearing the pain of others as opposed to sympathizing with them is widely regarded as evidence of pathology. We think that it's fair to hold a person morally and legally accountable for past crime only if she's the one and the same person who committed the past crime. Consequentialists take facts about a personal identity to be indirectly rather than directly relevant to the legitimacy of punishment and reward, insofar as punishing a person for a past crime only when they're the same person as the person who committed the crime tends, in fact, to maximize overall utility. Or they have it as a side constraint. I guess they're not full consequentialists if they do that. It would be unfair, for example, to hold you responsible for my past misdeeds or to force you to repay debts acquired by me, even if you happen to be exactly like me. We think that while others may wish that I had acted differently in the past, they cannot regret my past mistakes in the way that I can. We ordinarily think that a person is entitled to ownership of a particular piece of property if and only if she's the same person as the earlier person who legitimately acquired it, and so on. Answers to the metaphysical question, therefore, seem to have important practical considerations for our expectations and attitudes towards the future, whose debts we are obliged to repay, whose property we're entitled to, whose past actions we can be held responsible for, regret, and for how we should treat and be treated by others, or so it has traditionally been supposed. The assumption that there are these connections between the concept of one and the same persons persisting through time and our most fundamental concerns explains our special interest in the question of what makes for the persistence of persons, as in contrast to that of, say, bicycles or cane toads. Definitely written by an Australian. But a striking move in some influential recent discussions of personal identity has been to seek to sever the metaphysical facts of personal identity from those that are of practical importance of personal identity. It has been claimed that answers to the metaphysical question need not or should not have the practical significance commonly supposed. The relations among person stages that structure our person-directed concerns need not be or coincide with the relations that make different person stages belong to the same person. I will call this claim the practical irrelevance thesis. Yeah, that's not going in Hypernomicon. For it says that our practical reasons for identifying and re-identifying people as the same over time are irrelevant to the question of who or what we are. Let's actually put it in just here. That took me about 20 more keystrokes than it ought to have taken. The practical relevance thesis is not new. Derek perfectly famously defended a version of it under the slogan "Identity is not what matters in survival." For an influential and to my mind persuasive reply, St. Louis, 1976. Have I read this? Yeah, but I didn't put it in Hypernomicon because this was many years ago. But it has come to play a new and central role in some prominent recent defenses of a bodily criterion of personal identity, which have invoked it in order to explain away the widespread intuitive appeal of rival psychological criterion. Yes, correct. These defenses of a bodily metaphysical criterion claim that the psychological criterion derives its intuitive appeal from cohering most closely with what we care about in our own continued existence and that of others, combined with the intuitive assumption that continuing to exist is worth caring about. This provides a key argument for the view that psychological criterion provides the correct answer to the metaphysical question. However, they argue if the relations that govern our person-directed concerns and practices need not coincide with those that make for a personal persistence in a metaphysical sense, then intuitions about what is of practical importance have no bearing on the issue of what is the correct criterion of metaphysical personal identity. The fact that anticipatory concern, ascriptions of responsibility, and the like follow psychological relations among person stages rather than bodily ones, insofar as they do, should not be taken to show that a psychological criterion of personal persistence is correct, nor that the bodily criterion is incorrect. For if the practical relevancy thesis is right, our continued existence might consist in the continued existence and functioning of enough of our body and our brain and our body, even while what is worth caring about is not such bodily continuity, but rather continuity of our distinctive mental life, memories, projects, values, characters, and the like. Eric Olson, for example, claims that a psychological criterion may be correct as an account of being the same person in the practical sense of the same person, but maintains that a bodily criterion, specifically a bodily biological criterion, nevertheless remains the correct criterion of personal identity in a strict and absolute sense. And Mario Schechtman writes that once answers to the metaphysical question are freed from the inappropriate demand to account for the practical importance of personal identity, the intuitive pull of psychological criterion and metaphysical personal identity dissipates, and the arguments for bodily re-identification criterion are overwhelming. While Olson holds that being the same person in the metaphysical sense is neither necessary nor sufficient for rational anticipatory concern, moral, legal accountability, and the like, Schechtman argues only that's not sufficient. It's Olson's stronger claim that's my target here. In Staying Alive, Personal Continuation of the Life We're Having, Chapter 2 of this volume, Schechtman seems inclined to view the practical metaphysical questions as more closely connected than this earlier work might suggest. Schechtman seems to move around a bit, in my experience. My central aim is to show that the answer to the metaphysical question of personal identity cannot plausibly be severed from practical questions in this way. The objection is not simply that detaching the metaphysical question from everything we care about would render the metaphysical question of little or no interest, except perhaps to a small coterie of metaphysicians and philosophers of biology, although I think this is true. There's a connected but potentially more significant problem. Plausibly, the value theoretic connections among personal stages are partly constitutive of metaphysical personal identity over time. A person may be a non-natural social kind, more akin to nation or corporation than to natural kind concepts such as water or gold. That is, an entity whose persistence conditions are partly determined by the practices of individuals and communities. It's, 6. For a more detailed discussion of the analogy between persons and nations, see Brad Mitchell. Okay. If so, divorcing the answer to the metaphysical question from the role that criteria for personal identity are supposed to play in governing these practices does not simply produce an account of personal identity that is the theoretical epiphenomenon, it changes the subject and so fails to provide an analysis of personal identity at all. Or so I will argue. I begin the second section by outlining in more detail the role that the practical irrelevancy thesis has played in defenses of bodily continuity theory. I will focus here on Eric Olson's discussion of the human animal because of its influence and clarity. In subsequent sections, I will sketch the case for taking the person-directed concerns and practices to be partly constitutive of personal identity. I will conclude by exploring some implications of this view for bodily criterion of personal identity. Contrary to some, I don't think that recognizing a constitutive link between metaphysical personal identity and our patterns of caring necessarily counts straightforwardly in favor of psychological criterion and against the bodily criterion. For example, Denis Robinson suggests that personal identity can be seen as matching up with what we most distinctly care about and caring about personal survival only if persons are mentalistically rather than biologically individuated. See Robinson, 2004. While allowing the bodily similarities may carry some weight, Lewis agrees in establishing a necessary connection between personal identity and what matters roughly by defining the I relation, the relation that unites distinct times and places into a single continuum person in terms of the R relation, relations of psychological continuity or connectedness among time slices. Oh, right, these are people who disagree. In fact, I think the analysis goes some way to explaining why some people find a bodily criterion of personal identity so compelling. Cool. Who's this Robinson thing? I fear I must now read this. It's getting downloaded, at least. I feel like my internet browser takes like 1,000 years to start up when I'm streaming this stuff. It makes things less efficient. Yeah, I don't know what's wrong. Maybe my CPU is being overtaxed. Maybe open broadcasting software being in the stream chat is doing something. Yeah, This thing is cited by 17, including On the Concept of Sexual Perversion by K. Miller. Christine Miller is citing it mostly. Okay. Downloading the PDF now. PDF secured. The Practical Irrelevance Thesis and Animalism. Olson defends an increasingly influential approach of bodily criterion that he calls biological approach, otherwise known as animalism. Other prominent defenders include Von and Wagen, and Snowden. According to Olson's animalism, we are essentially human animals, not persons, and our persistence conditions are those of the members of the species Homo sapiens, namely biological continuity. Being a person is merely a phase in the life of a human animal, the phase when the human animal is self-conscious and thinking, akin to being a child or being a prime minister, just as we can survive growing up or losing an election, so we can survive having our psychology radically altered or entirely obliterated, indeed, without being a person, the self-conscious thinking being at all. Animalism turns the metaphysical question of personal identity into a question about the persistence condition for human animals. The pressing questions of psychological identity equate to questions in the philosophy of biology, concerning exactly how much and what kind of biological continuity is required for the persistence of members of the species Homo sapiens is a zygote. So blastomere, a human animal, is a corpse, a human animal, is a brain, but human animal, according to Olson, a human animal, and so you or I survive just in case one's purely animal functions, metabolism, the capacity to breathe and circulate one's blood, and the like continue. No kind of metacontinuity is either necessary or sufficient for a continued existence. Bodily continuity theories of metaphysical personal identity, such as animalism, seem to fall afoul of our intuitive response to cases, such as the following contemporary variants on Locke's case, the Prince and the Cobbler, which Olson discusses at length. Once there was a prince called Prince and a cobbler called Cobbler. One day, Prince's cerebrum was cut out of his head and implanted in the head of Cobbler, whose own cerebrum has been removed and destroyed. Two human beings resulted from this. One of them, called Brainy, had Cobbler's arms, legs, and trunk and other parts of Prince's cerebrum. Brainy looked just like Cobbler, but he had Prince's personality and was able to remember much of Prince's past as Prince could. He knew nothing whatever about Cobbler's past. The other offshoot, Brainless, had all of Prince's parts except his missing cerebrum, although Brainless could wake and sleep, cough and sneeze, and even make reflex movements with his arms and legs. His eyes could only vacantly stare at the ceiling. He was in roughly the sort of persistent vegetative state that sometimes results from massive cerebral damage. Animalism says that the Prince survives the operation as brainless. I missed... Oh, 9 is right here. It's worth noting that the intuition that personal identity need not coincide with bodily identity is not confined to possible cases, which some have suggested may sometimes be less than a wholly reliable guide to a concept, but arises in response to actual cases as well. Does a person survive in a permanent vegetative state? Does a person's life history include zygote or fetal stages? Does, in some of the more extreme cases, multiple personality disorder, where there's the learner-psychological integration between the distinct personalities? Is there the learner-psychological, or is there one person associated with one body, or two, or more? Many people who reflect on the real-life cases are inclined to say that a person does not survive in a persistent vegetative state, for example. While the human being or human animal lives on, the person is no more. In this, Olson's animalism differs from brain-based varieties of versions of bodily criterion, which may have the Prince's brainy, the person who inherits most of Prince's functioning brain, and also that from versions that take the preservation of basic or core mental functions, such as the capacity for conscious experience, to be essential for continued existence. See, for example, Nicola Wiggins. But as Olson acknowledges, many people, when presented with this kind of story, are inclined to say something different. Prince's brainy and the person who inherits Prince's cerebrum and all of Prince's distinctive mental life. Brainy believes he is Prince, seems to remember living Prince's life, has all the Prince's intentions, values, character, and so on, and this continuity has its normal cause, the continued existence and functioning of parts of Prince's brain, the cerebrum, though directly responsible for realizing Prince's mental life. Brainless, on the other hand, has what remains of Prince's body, but none of Prince's psychology, and indeed is plausibly no longer a person at all. Following Olson, let's call the intuition that Prince is brainy, and more generally that we go where our mental life goes, not where our body goes in cases where these come apart, the transplant intuition. Okay, we put it in the thing. Cool. As Olson acknowledges, the transplant intuition has a considerable hold on many people. In the face of it, suggests that animalism is mistaken, at least as a piece of descriptive conceptual analysis. Bodily criterion might instead be advocated as a revisionary analysis. The claim here would be that even if psychological criterion better fits the established practices of linguistic usage, we nevertheless should revise our existing conception and identify persons with human brains, bodies, or animals for some other relevant reason, or other theoretical reason. It may be argued that considerations of fundamental ontology reveal that psychological continuants do not exist, only bodily continuants do, or it may be argued that human animal is more intrinsically eligible to be met by a person talk than any rival candidate, meaning and virtue of carving nature at its joints. For a skeptical discussion of these possibilities, see Sido. I don't think I will, at least not right now. Animalists need to find a principled way of explaining away transplant-style intuitions. Unless they do, we have no reason to reject them. According to Olson, the key to explaining away the transplant intuition lies in recognizing the task of the same person as two quite distinct senses, a practical sense and a strict and absolute sense, and that, as Parfit has shown, contrary to what we are naturally inclined to assume, these two senses need not coincide. Different stages are stages of the same person in the strict and absolute sense of same person, if and only if they're numerically identical with each other, or alternatively, as four dimensionalists put it, if and only if they are distinct stages, temporal parts of a single continuum person, identical with itself and nothing else. For clarity, call this numerical sense of same person numerical. In fact, Olson's own formulation of the metaphysical question presupposes that different stages of persisting persons are strictly identical, and so it's incompatible with four-dimensionalism. Olson's formulation seems to me unacceptably narrow for the reasons outlined in note 2 above. In the practical sense, being the same person as refers to the relation of practical importance and personal persistence. It is, of course, possible that different practical roles are organized around different relations. For example, prudential concern might follow certain psychological connections among person stages, while property entitlements follow bodily connections. For simplicity, in what follows, I set aside this possibility. Call this practical concept of personal identity, same person practical. Olson defines the practical conception of being the same person as follows: x at time t is the same person as y at the later time t star, if and only if x at t stands to y at t star, and some relations are in virtue of which x ought to be prudentially concerned at t for y's well-being at t star, and y is responsible at t star for what x does at t, and it's natural right to at t star to treat y as if she were x. To avoid concerns about circularity, prudential concern may be understood as quasi-prudential concern by analogy with quasi-memory. Quasi-prudential concern feels just like ordinary anticipatory self-concern, except that we cannot assume that the future person stages that are objects of such concern are necessarily the same person at the earlier stages who have the attitude of concern. According to Olson, then, we have a transplant intuition because we think that Prince is the same person practical as brainy, and because we naturally assume that different stages of the same person practical, then they must be stages of the same person numerical. It's worth noting that it's not clear that common sense draws a direct link between numerical identity and self-interested concern, moral and legal accountability. Like the link may be indirect. Common sense says that sameness of person over time is preconditioned for self-interested concern and moral and legal accountability, but it may be further in separate assumption to think the sameness of person involves literal identity. Evidence that the link is indirect rather than direct is that people who come to believe that being the same person over time does not involve the continuation of the strictly identical thing. Stage theorists, for instance, do not typically conclude that prudential concern, etc., is without rational foundation as a consequence. That sounds right. My ribs hurt. Conversely, we infer that Prince is not the same person numerical as brainless from the fact that it seems to us that brainless is not the same person practical as Prince. Olson writes, we have the transplantation intuition, I suspect, in large part because we think that Prince ought to be prudentially concerned about what happens to Brainy and not about what happens to brainless, or because Brainy is morally responsible for Prince's actions and not Cobbler's, and because everyone would rightfully feel compelled to treat Brainy as if he were Prince, or some combination of these. That is, the transplant intuition is based on practical concerns that may be perfectly valid, but that do not necessarily coincide with numerical identity. Transplant style intuitions can thus be explained in a way that's consistent with bodily criterion of numerical personal identity, albeit at the cost of revisions to our ordinary ways of thinking and speaking. Using same person in the practical sense, we can say, while person survives the operation as brainless, Prince and brainless are not the same person. It's Brainy who, after the operation, is the person that Prince was before, even though Brainy and Prince are two different beings. And although Brainy is numerically identical with Cobbler, he's not the same person, after all, as Cobbler was before. The upshot is that metaphysical and practical questions of personal identity become two quite distinct and unconnected subject matters. On the one hand, there's a metaphysical question of what makes different person stages, What makes different stages belong to a different, strictly identical person? This is the question for metaphysicians and philosophers of biology. As Shepard writes, pursuit of the re-identification question will most likely involve an investigation into specific metaphysical problems with re-identifying human beings, as well as the more generic metaphysical problems about re-identifying changing material objects over time. On the other hand, there is a practical question. What's the relation among person stages that should organize their person-directed attitudes and concerns? This is a question for moral philosophers, not metaphysicians. As Olson writes, it's for ethicists to tell us when prudential concern is rational, when someone can be held accountable for which past actions, and who deserves to be treated as whom. There are at least two worries about divorcing the answer to metaphysical question from the practical consequences that have traditionally been thought to attach to it. The first and most obvious is that devoid of any connections with our person-directed attitudes and concerns, the metaphysical question loses most of its interest. We care about the question of persistence of conditions for human animals insofar as being the same human animal coincides with being the same person, and so is an important implication for how we live and feel our lives. But divorced from all these usual connections with our emotions and motivations, the question of what are the persistence conditions for human animals is no longer of any interest to most of us, or at any rate is no more interest than the question of what are the persistence conditions for a species of mid-sized mammal. Indeed, if the practical irrelevance thesis were right, it would be hard to see why most of us should care what is the correct answer to the metaphysical question at all. I'm sleepy. But there's a more serious concern. It's not clear that the concept that does not play the important practical role we assign personal identity in governing what we care about, our personal relations, our institutional punishment, reward, and the like, could count as a concept of personal identity at all, even in a metaphysical sense. For playing this practical role may be partly constitutive of a concept being a concept of metaphysical, practical, personal identity. There should be a where made. There should be. I don't have Olson in here, right? Is this the book? This is not the book. This is not the 19. This is 2007. I should have opened that for whatever. I'm not doing it right now. Person as a forensic term. On one interpretation, this is the content of Locke's famous concept. This is the content of Locke's famous question. Famous claim that person is a forensic concept. Locke begins the body of his discussion of personal identity by noting that in order to conceive or judge of questions of identity aright, we must consider that what idea the word it is applied to stands for. It being one thing to be the same substance, another the same man, and third the same person. If person, man, and substance are three names standing for three different ideas, for such as is the idea belonging to that name, such must be the identity. Man, Locke argues, is a term that we use to name a human animal. The persistence conditions for men are therefore those governing the persistence of a certain kind of animal. They elicit a participation of the same continued life by constantly fleeting particles of matter in succession, vitally united to the same organized body. When it comes to the question of what are the identity criterions for men, members of the species Homo sapien, Locke thinks that animalism gives the correct answer, but person, says Locke, stands for a different idea, which he thinks, if it had been a little more carefully attended to, would possibly have prevented a great deal of confusion, especially concerning personal identity. Person, unlike man or human animal, which may be more akin to a natural kind term, is a forensic or value theoretic term, appropriating action and their merit. Locke writes, in this, personal identity is founded all the right and justice of reward and punishment. When it comes to the question of what are the identity criterion for persons, Locke famously rejects animalism in favor of a psychological criterion. As you would expect, given this forensic understanding of person, Locke does so chiefly on the grounds that sameness of consciousness rather than sameness of substance, either material or immaterial, thus the relation that governs our prudential concern for future existence, attitudes of owning and imputing to our present self the actions and experiences of ourselves, and descriptions of moral and legal responsibility. One of Locke's primary concerns was to show that sameness of consciousness need not coincide with the underlying continuity of particular substances of natural kind, either material sameness of body or immaterial sameness of soul. If a person's mental life were to be realized uninterrupted through time by a succession of distinct immaterial entities or by a succession of different bodies, there would be one and the same person, though clearly not the same man or soul. Conversely, sameness of substance, either material or immaterial, would be insufficient for personal identity in the absence of consciousness, Locke writes. For, as to this point of being the same self, it matters not whether this present self be made up of the same or other substances. I, being as much concerned and as justly accountable for any action that was done a thousand years since, appropriate to me by this self-consciousness as I am for what I did the last moment. As this quotation illustrates, and as many commentators have noted, Locke argued for the view that personal identity consists of sameness of consciousness rather than sameness of substance, primarily by appeal to our intuitive judgments about what continuities among how a person is at various times are of forensic importance. Locke describes a variety of possible cases in which soul, body, and psychological life come apart in various ways, asks who, if anyone, in each of the cases would be worthy of our potential concern in this question of moral and legal accountability, thinks rightly or wrongly that our intuitive judgments about who should be held responsible for what, and so on, follow sameness of consciousness rather than sameness of substance, and concludes that, therefore, personal identity consists in sameness of consciousness. The driving assumption is that personal identity consists in the relation among person stages that is the reasonable object of our forensic practices. It is natural, therefore. Oh, I gotta change the title. Sorry. Her name is Carol Westbrook. No, Carol. Sorry, that was somewhat delayed. Whatever, something around here. The driving assumption, yeah, and it's natural, although not of course obligatory, to interpret Locke as meaning same person in the metaphysical sense, the same sense of identity that applies to substances and animals that Locke discusses in the first place in the same language of identity. This is the orthodox interpretation, but see David Vellman, who interprets Locke as offering a criterion of perspectival selfhood as distinct from a criterion of metaphysical personal identity. If the argument for this chapter is right, then there are important conceptual connections between criteria for perspectival selfhood and a criterion of metaphysical personal identity, and make some exploratory suggestions along these lines in section 7. If this is right, then Locke's argument for a psychological criterion is something like this. Metaphysical personal identity consists in the relations among different person stages. That's forensic significance. Conceptual claim. Sameness of consciousness is the relation of that is of forensic significance. Empirical claim, evidenced by our judgments about who should be held responsible for what, and so on in various puzzle cases. Therefore, metaphysical personal identity consists in sameness of consciousness. Two interpretations. There are, however, two importantly different ways of interpreting Locke's view that person is forensic term. Which we can, so there needs to be an A here, which we can introduce by way of question reminiscent of Plato's Youth and Frog. Sameness of consciousness practically significant because it's the relation of personal identity, or does personal identity consist in sameness of consciousness because sameness of consciousness is the relation that is of practical significance? If we interpret Locke the first way, then his view is that the criterion of personal identity are determined independently of our person-directed concerns. It's not because sameness of consciousness is forensically significant that it constitutes personal identity. Rather, it's because personal identity consists in sameness of consciousness that sameness of consciousness is practically significant. Facts about personal identity are here taken to be what Mark Johnson calls independent justifiers of person-directed attitudes and practices. On this interpretation of Locke's view, the intuition that it would be appropriate to hold the cobbler responsible for Prince's past crimes is evidence that the cobbler is the same person numerically as the prince, but not part of what constitutes them as stage is the same person numerically. Just as the presence of Fred's fingerprints at the scene of the crime is evidence that he is present at the crime scene, but possibly not part of what makes him identical with the person at the crime scene. Different person stages are stages of the same person practically because they're stages of the same person numerically. My ribs really hurt. I don't know what's going on here. The second interpretation of Locke's view, things go the other way around. The practical consequences of judgments about personal identity enter into determining the answer to the metaphysical question and so into the truth conditions for judgments of personal identity. On this constitutive approach, personal identity consists in sameness of consciousness rather than sameness of either material or immaterial substance, in part because sameness of consciousness is a relation that is of forensic significance. It's in part because we regard as for psychological continuum of us as worthy of a prudential concern that they are the same person to us, and it's in part because they are appropriate for later stages to own and impute to themselves the actions of earlier stages only when they have consciousness of those actions. That it's correct to regard earlier stages as stages of the same person and to hold that later stages accountable for their actions. On this interpretation, different person stages would not be stages of the same person numerically, where they're not stages of the same person practically, and this is because different stages belong to the same person numerically, partly in virtue of their being stages of the same person practically. On either interpretation, Locke's view stands at odds with the practical irrelevancy thesis, since both interpretations take judgments about metaphysical personal identity to have practical consequences, and necessarily so. On the first interpretation, it's the independent truth of morality or rationality that's appropriate to regard and treat earlier and later stages of the same person only if they are the same person in the metaphysical sense. If personal identity consists in sameness of consciousness, then we should organize our person-directed concerns around sameness of consciousness, because that's what personal identity consists in. If, on the other hand, it turns out that animalism was the correct answer to the metaphysical question, then it would follow that we should structure our person-directed practices around sameness of human-animal. On the second constitutive interpretation, the practical irrelevancy thesis is mistaken for a different reason. The answer to that metaphysical question cannot be severed from our personal-directed practices and concerns, nor settled independently of them, because it's partly determined by them. The case for the constitutive view. The view that there are constitutive connections between metaphysical personal identity and our person-directed attitudes and practices has been suggested by a number of contemporary writers. Michael Dummett, for instance, writes, "We can easily imagine persons who use different criteria from ours. Precisely what men make the criteria they use criteria for personal identity would lie in their attaching the same consequences in regard to responsibility, motivation, etc. to their statements of personal identity that we do." Yeah, I think, so I've run across this quote already. I don't think I put it in because I don't have Dummett in there. Maybe it's in here. Maybe it's in here. I don't know why this is nested under metaphysical facts. Whatever, we'll figure that out later. Whatever. Dummett's point is that judgments of metaphysical personal identity have certain effective and evaluative consequences. It's because people attach these consequences to what they call personal identity that the criteria they use are criteria of personal identity. This point is similar to one frequently made by moral philosophers who note that there seems to be an internal conceptual connection between making of a moral judgment and the possession of certain motivational and evaluational attitudes. Randy Eklund makes a similar point. Yeah. Well. Yes. To sincerely assert that X is good is not simply to make a factual judgment about X, but also thereby to say something about how X ought to be valued. Something similar seems to be true of judgments about personhood and personal identity over time. To say that X is a person is supposed to be not simply to attribute certain factual characteristics, for example, self-consciousness and the ability to reason to X, but also thereby to say something about how X should be regarded and treated as in virtue of possessing these characteristics. This is why denials of personhood are so troubling, for such denials are precisely not practically inert. To deny that a certain being or class of persons class of beings or persons is to thereby say that they are entitled to moral consideration and standing due to persons. And to say that X at an earlier time is the same person as Y at a later time is not simply to judge that certain factual conditions are satisfied, but also thereby to say something about the appropriateness of prudential concern and ascriptions of responsibility in virtue of those conditions obtaining. Among other things, it's to say that X and Y are related in a way that it would be appropriate to hold Y accountable for X's actions and for X to be prudentially concerned for Y, all other things being equal. There would, for example, be something very odd about someone who confidently asserted that some event or process, say teletransportation, literally resulted in a person's death, and yet was perfectly happy to be ushered into the teletransporter along with her loved ones. If we confronted such a person, it would initially be hard to believe that she really means what she says. The dissonance between her judgment and her effective and valuable attitudes would, at the very least, call for further explanation. Perhaps she's in the grips of suicidal depression, or perhaps our words same person means something different to ours. An example may help to bring out the plausibility of the key point. Suppose, for the sake of argument, the animalists are right that our conception of metaphysical personal identity is such as to require continuity of a particular human brain or animal. It's nevertheless seems possible to imagine a community of human beings who take a different view. We might imagine a community of human beings living in an environment where high levels of radiation make it impossible for the human body to survive for more than a few years. To combat the effects of radiation, this community has developed a technology that enables the information from a person's brain to be copied in the brain of a fresh duplicate body, cloned from the original held in storage, especially for this purpose. While the original radiation-affected brain and body are destroyed, the clone emerges from the procedure with all the psychology and behavior dispositions of the original person, but with a new brain and body able to resist the effects of radiation for another few years, after which time the procedure is repeated. Suppose, following Sidney Shoemaker, to whom the example is due, that in such a society, going in for body changes is routine as occurrence as going in to have one's teeth cleaned is in ours. It's taken for granted by everyone that the procedure is person-preserving. One frequently hears remarks like, I can't meet you for lunch on Tuesday because that's the date for my body change. Let's meet on Wednesday instead. All of the social practices of the society presuppose that the procedure is person-preserving. The brain state recipient is regarded as owning the property of the brain state donors, as being married to the brain donor's spouse, and is holding whatever offices, responsibilities, rights, obligations, etc. the brain state donor held. If it's found that the brain state donor had committed a crime, everyone regards it as just that the brain state recipient should be punished for it. Suppose further that in this world there are no immaterial substances such as Cartesian souls, and that this community do not have any false beliefs about what happens physically speaking to brains, bodies, and psychologies of individuals who undergo the brain state transfer procedure. They do not believe that a procedure transfers an immaterial soul or whatever, so that, as Shoemaker says, there is no clear sense in which they can be said to be mistaken about the matter of impersonal fact regarding the procedure as person-preserving. Imagine we confront such a society. We might imagine ourselves in the role of anthropologists investigating the belief systems of foreign culture. They would, as Shoemaker said, be a strong case for saying that what they mean by person is such that the BST procedure is person-preserving, using person in their sense, and what goes with this, it would be very hard to say that they are irrational when being under no misconception regarding matters of fact, they willingly subject themselves to the BST procedure. This community organizes their person-directed practices and concerns around a relation among person stages. Psychological continuity with liberal cause, that is hypothesized different from the relation that structures ours. Nonetheless, it seems very plausible to say that psychological continuity with liberal cause is their criterion of personal identity. What makes their different criterion recognizable as criterion of personal identity is that they use this criterion to structure their person-directed attitudes and practices. As Shoemaker writes, they attach the same kind of social consequences to judgments of personal identity, i.e., personal identity has with them the same connections with moral responsibility, property ownership, etc., as it does with us. If so, then part of what makes the criterion our criterion of personal identity is that this criterion for us has the same practical significance that psychological continuity for liberal cause has with them. The upshot is that if being one the same human animal is not the relation that organizes our person-directed attitudes and practices, then it's not our criterion of personal identity. Shoemaker himself draws a different moral. He thinks that the fact that we recognize wide psychological continuity as being their criterion of personal identity is a reason for thinking that it's ours. As I hope is clear from the main text, I think this conclusion follows only if psychological continuity with liberal cause is the relation that organizes our person-directed concerns and practices, and as I explained in section 7, this may not be so, at least not unequivocally or universally. She keeps talking about section 7, section 6, section 5, but there's no numbering on these sections. It's a criterion only of animal identity, and to concede that psychological continuation is the relation that structures our person-directed practices and concerns would then be to concede that psychological criterion is our criterion of personal identity. This is to sketch something of a positive case for the view that metaphysical personal identity over time is partly constituted by our person-directed concerns. But this view stands opposed to a different view of the nature of the concept, a view that persons are a natural kind, which may well be a significant source of our motivation for bodily criteria such as animalism. It's worth bringing out what's prima facie mistaken about this approach. person, a forensic or natural kind term. Michael Lockwood provides a particularly clear and explicit statement of the natural kind view when he writes personal identity has a similar logic to that which the natural kind concept gold has on the common Kripke Putnam account. For A to be the same person, B is not a matter of merely A and B standing in certain relations to psychological continuity, memory, personality, or behavior. It is for there to hold between A and B whatever underlying continuity provides in the normal sense of in the normal case, the deep explanation for such superficial, casually observable continuities as those of memory, personality, the matching of action to intention, and so on. And what this underlying continuity is cannot be determined simply by conceptual analysis. It's a substantive, scientific, or some might think metaphysical question. Others who more or less explicitly endorse the natural kind analysis include Wiggins and Nagel. On this view, person is a natural kind term like gold or water, a term that rigidly designates whatever actually underlies or realizes psychological continuity. The nature of this underlying continuity, the intrinsic nature or essence of personal identity, is to be determined by empirical investigation, just as it was determined by empirical discovery that the essence of gold is atomic structure 79 and water is H2O. Let's make sure. Yeah. Well, no, she's about to. I don't even need to explain this. This is obvious. As quoted above, Lockwood's analysis leaves it open precisely as to the nature of the deep underlying continuity is. This is for scientists to tell us, where scientists discover that our mental life is actually realized and continued by an immaterial substance, then our persistent conditions would be those of an immaterial substance. In fact, however, science tells us that the underlying continuity that provides for psychological continuity in the normal cases are certain kinds of biological processes and events in our bodies, and in particular in our brains. So human persons are essentially human animals, or perhaps human brains, and the identity conditions for human persons are those of human animals and perhaps of human brains. As person, as we use the term a forensic term, referring to the relation among person stages that structures the person-directed attitudes and practices of individuals and communities, or is a natural kind term that rigidly designates the particular substance or natural kind that underlies psychological continuity in the actual world. It's widely agreed that some terms, gold and water, are relatively uncontroversial examples of natural kind terms. It's equally generally accepted that other kinds, such as nation and corporation, name non-natural social kinds. The question then is whether person is a concept of the first kind or the second. It is, of course, possible that it is indeterminate to which categories they belong, or that different people use the terms differently. It seems to me that we can tell person is not a natural kind term in much the way that we can tell that gold or water is one. See Robinson for this way of putting it. Does Robinson think it's a forensic term or just that it's not a natural kind term? I don't know. We'll just go for the easier one. I didn't know I had Wiggins 1980 in there. Interesting. Consider the case of water. Hilary Putnam convinced many people that water is a natural kind term by way of the following argument. Imagine a possible world, twin Earth, in which stuff that has superficial, causally observable properties of water is clear, potable, drinkable, liquid, falls from the sky, runs through the tap, fills the oceans, rivers, and so on, has different intrinsic nature. The watery stuff here on Earth, its chemical composition is XYZ rather than H2O. Would we call the watery stuff on twin Earth water? Putnam thought we would not, and many agree. We are not willing to call the watery stuff on twin Earth water, despite it having the superficial, observable characteristics of water here on Earth. This reveals that water in our mouths is a natural kind term, denoting in all possible worlds the stuff with the intrinsic nature of the actual watery stuff, namely H2O. Because the watery stuff on twin Earth is not H2O, is not water. If person, even implicitly restricted to mostly human persons of our actual acquaintance, were a natural kind term like water, then we would expect people to react to possible cases in which the distinctive mental life of human beings comes to be realized or furthered by abnormal causal mechanisms in the same way they react to the imaginary cases of twin Earth, namely to say that there is not the same person in such cases. And conversely, we would expect people to say that there is a continuing person, or if there is a continuing brain and or body, even in cases where there is no accompanying mental life. At least this is what it would take to show that person is a natural kind term by analogy with water. The reason for thinking that person is not a natural kind term like water or gold is precisely that many people do not say this. Many apparently competent language users are inclined to say that there is a persisting person wherever there is continuity of mental life, including in twin Earth-like cases where such continuity has an abnormal cause. Conversely, many find it plausible to say that there's no longer a person where there is biological continuity, but without the psychological continuity that normally accompanies it, as in real-life cases of human beings who through illness or accident are reduced to a persistent vegetative state. Philosophers do not have to invent twin Earth-like thought counter-experiments involving personal identity. History and contemporary popular culture abound with cases of persons becoming bionic men or continuing in a different body, as in teletransportation, Kafka's metamorphosis, or religious resurrection, all presented as different ways of persisting. The fact that so many people across cultures and times seem to find these kinds of stories intelligible makes it prima facie implausible to think that person, even implicitly restricted to the human person, is named a natural biological kind. On the contrary, they suggest that we are generally not biological essentialists or chauvinists about personhood, and that what is central to personhood at and over time is, as Locke thought, not biology per se, but rather psychological unity, which need not coincide with continuity of any particular underlying natural kind, as is traditionally conceived. As I discuss in the next section, it may be the case that not everyone is happy to say that there is a persisting person in cases where human being's psychological life is continued by abnormal means. That would reveal that there is some semantic variation. The task for advocates of the natural kind approach would then be to show that those who use the term differently are making a mistake. I don't know if the two options are natural kind term or forensic term or indeterminate. There's probably more. Pretty convincing. The constitutive view has an important consequence for the debate over whether bodily or psychological criterion is the correct criterion of metaphysical personal identity. It's often supposed that taken criteria of personal identity be partly constituted by our patterns of concern about identity supports the psychological criterion over bodily ones, since psychological continuity is often supposed to be what we care about in personal identity, but I don't think this is so, not straightforwardly or universally. I think that defenders of bodily criterion would be conceding too much were they to grant that intuitions about what is of practical significance in personal identity necessarily or even always, in fact, favor psychological continuities. Some people, even after considerable informed reflection, remain convinced that they would not survive processes such as BST or teletransportation, in which a person's original brain and body is destroyed and their mental life continues uninterrupted by some other means, or so informal polls and introductory classes suggest. I think this conviction is partly to be explained by the fact that these people attach great practical significance to certain bodily connections in matters of survival. We each have a self-conception and conception of what is important to being who we are. While our self-conception is developed in a social context and is heavily shaped and constrained by practices and expectations of the society in which we live, in interaction with facts about a particular bodily and psychological makeup, there remains some leeway for individuals to defer in the degree of importance they assign to various bodily and psychological connections that obtain between person stages. There are important further questions about how much leeway is permissible before people have made a mistake, or at least change the subject. I address these in the bounds of personhood and misconventions would be constrained. Is that this? Let's check the internet. So what's this called? The bounds of personhood must conventionalism be constrained, and of course the title of this may have changed. I myself have cited some unpublished manuscripts, the title of which has changed. We're going to wait like 20 minutes for my internet browser to pop up. If anybody's there in chat, now is a good time to say so. Surely nobody is there. No hits on Google for that title. So now we must check her CV and fill papers. Yeah, this is the website I've got for her, which maybe does have a full CV. The only personal identity thing published since then is this. So it's this or bust. Do we think the bounds of personhood must conceptualism be constrained? Is personal identity conceptual analysis and no-fault disagreements? No, we don't. Because that's not it. Do you think I should email her for this? I'm thinking about it. Let's see if it's on field papers. She has 3 in-progress papers on field papers, and none of them are this. I might email her. Not now, obviously. For some people, professional philosophers or dedicated political activists, for example, certain mental abilities and intellectual passions may be extremely central to their conception of who they are, or for a future person continuous with them in some respects, but dispossessing them of these defining abilities and passions may seem to be not quite them. For other people, professional athletes or opera singers, for instance, certain physical capacities and attributes may be central, perhaps in some cases considerably more central than the kinds of mental activities and continuities that typically matter so much to philosophers. Nozick expresses a similar view at one point, asking, does bodily continuity have greater weight for basketballers than for philosophers? But what of people who have both? it is plausible that our own self-conception influences how we each respond to puzzle cases. When we're presented with a puzzle case, we typically imaginatively project ourselves into the situation described. We imagine ourselves in the position of the person about to undergo the process of or procedure as it's presented, BSD brainwashing, teletransportation, or whatever it might be, and we ask ourselves will the resulting person be me? Our answer to this question implicitly reflects and is shaped by our self-conception, in particular whether the process described is one that preserves the particular relations we take to be the most central to our being and remaining who we are. The degree to which the resulting person will be continuous with us in ways that we take to matter greatly to our being who we are affects the degree to which we are prepared to extend potential consideration to the resulting person, so the extent to which we are inclined to judge them as being the same person as us. If a person's judgments about identity in the various puzzle cases are importantly affected by our own self-conception, then we can explain differences between people over whether a particular process is person-preserving, partly in terms of differences in their self-conception and related patterns of concern. Those who judge the process such as BSD would not preserve identity plausibly do so in part because they assign very great weight to certain kinds of bodily connection among person stages. A future person with their psychology but with a different brain and body doesn't sufficiently answer sufficiently closely to their conception of who they are. Those who judge such a procedure as person-preserving, or on the other hand, plausibly assign considerably less weight to these kinds of bodily connections. For them, continuity of their current brain and or body does not matter so much, so long as their memories, projects, values, and the like are reliably continued by some other means. Perhaps it also matters somewhat that the resulting person has a body that's reasonably similar to the original, but even here people seem to differ. These claims concern the psychology of deliberation about person identity puzzle cases. They do not in themselves bear on the metaphysical question. However, if facts about personal identity are determined in part by what individuals take to matter in their own survival, then an individual's self-conception enters into determining whether the process is person-preserving or not, and not simply whether a process is person-preserving and not into their view about whether it is. Then an individual's self-conception enters in determining whether a process is person-preserving or not. And, oh, I see now. Enters into determining whether a process is person-preserving and not simply into their view about whether it is. Okay, that took me 5 times. There are important further questions about how much weight should be given to the various individuals as compared to the social ones. So I thought she was going individualistic, but here she's just saying, I don't know. And whether the social practices enter directly and constitutively into determining a person's survival conditions or only indirectly and causally insofar as the individual patterns. Yeah, so right at the end she pulls away from where I thought she was going, which was individualism. That's interesting. The orthodox view among defenders of psychological criterion is that those who give bodily criteria continue to great weight in questions of person's survival are mistaken or irrational, or at least have changed the subject. If what I've argued here is right, that's not necessarily so. Being the same human animal may have great practical significance for some people or in some communities. It might be reasonable, and here she even goes communities. It may be the reasonable object of their self-concern descriptions of moral, legal, accountability, property, entitlements, and so on. Great bodily attachment might be the reason why some of us would refuse to do the teletransporter, preferring a long and uncomfortable journey by more traditional matter-preserving means instead. It's certainly a question why some human characters in science fiction novels or films quite intelligibly prefer to die sooner in their current body rather than to live on in the series of new ones to which their psychology has been transferred. See, for example, Hamilton. Never heard of it. Let's see. Four stars on Goodread, 4.5 on Amazon, but it's part of the Commonwealth saga, which is only 2 books long, so that's not so bad. Don't think I'm going to read it. It might be argued that such brute bodily attachment is irrational, but that would have to be argued. It's not obviously so. Nothing seems clearly to rule out the human animal from being the reasonable object of the individual or community's person-directed attitudes and practices. So a concept that individuals or communities might legitimately employ is their concept of personal identity. The point is that what would make persistence the human animal, the criterion of personal identity in this case is that it has those connections with the attitudes, emotions, and practice. So this is just like, bloop, I'm a conventionalist, and so we could be an animalist if we wanted to. Is there even like an argument? No, this is just spelling out the consequence. And yeah. I've argued that the concept of personal identity is a concept of relation among person stages that organizes the person-directed attitudes and practices, and that the relation among person stages counts as a relation of personal identity, partly because it plays its role. To answer the metaphysical question of personal identity over time is inextricably conceptually tied to practical questions. I have explored two interesting consequences. One considers the coherence of the strategy of defending animalism as an account of the identity criterion for persons by forcing it from what we care about, if I'm right. This comes at a very great cost. The cost of that bodily criterion is no longer a criterion of personal identity. Second is that traditional debate over whether which of the bodily or psychological criterion is the correct criterion for metaphysical personal identity comes to be viewed in a new light. This debate may be seen as a debate over what matters or is worth caring about in personal identity, and in the absence of an argument for thinking that there is a particular relation that, in virtue of its intrinsic features, is especially or uniquely deserving to be that which structures the person-directed concerns of individuals and communities. It may be that there is no single correct answer as to whether the bodily criterion or personal or psychological criterion is correct. The question of what makes for a person's continued existence might legitimately settle in different ways. Cool. I don't think yeah, her only real argument is the one we already put in. No, that's not what I... Wait. This one. Which I already got from Eklund, but such is life. It's nice to have another person making the argument, I suppose. Okay, so next up would be this. And after that, the two Kovacs's. And then finally the Longenecker. I think I'm too tired for this. Am I? It's 20 pages. How long are the Kovacs? Ooh, 30, 15, 19. How long did this take? This probably took... I don't know how long it took. And I mistyped her name here. But it doesn't matter. We are done for now. Okay, thank you for joining me, although I don't think anybody actually did. I'll see you next time.